In 1944, Germany saw something it couldn't ignore. High above the Pacific Ocean, a silver bomber flew farther, faster, and higher than any airplane the world had ever seen. The Americans called it the B-29 Superfortress, a machine so amazing it could drop 12,000 pounds of bombs, then fly back across oceans without ever getting hit. To the German government, it was more than a weapon. It was a challenge. So they tried to build their own. They drew wings wider than a church, attached 6 engines, and told their leader it could reach New York. But when their version finally took off, it could barely fly across southern Germany. The bomber that was supposed to strike America couldn't even cross the Alps mountains. The B-29 Superfortress was an American success of unbelievable numbers. It could fly over 500-600 miles without refueling. It reached heights above 31,000 feet, higher than any German fighter plane could climb. Its bomb load was more than 12,000 pounds, enough to destroy entire neighborhoods in a single trip. It flew pressurized, protected by remote-controlled gun turrets, and was built with parts made to an exactness of 1/1000th of an inch. It cost $3 billion to develop, more than the Manhattan Project. Germany's answer was the Junkers Ju-390. On paper, its range was more than 6,000 miles. Its wings stretched 165 feet. It carried 6 engines and the hopes of a desperate war machine. But on its first flight, it barely made it past 200 miles before the engines overheated. The second prototype never left the ground. They dreamed of crossing the Atlantic Ocean. They barely survived crossing Bavaria, Germany. By the spring of 1943, Germany was under attack from the sky. The British came by night. The Americans came by day. Hundreds of bombers filled the air in waves so thick they cast shadows over entire cities. In the north, Hamburg was turned to ash. In the west, Cologne collapsed under the weight of powerful explosives and firebombs. Berlin itself, once untouchable, now burned with terrifying regularity. The heart of Germany was being destroyed not by tanks or soldiers, but by steel wings from across the sea. Factories fell silent. Oil supplies dried up. Railroad lines twisted in the heat. War production, once the pride of Nazi industry, was now struggling under an air attack it couldn't stop or fight back against. Then came the reports from Switzerland, from Spain, from Allied prisoners. Whispers about a new kind of bomber, American, enormous and untouchable, the B-29 Superfortress. It could fly higher than any fighter plane, faster than any regular anti-aircraft gun could reach. It carried over 12,000 pounds of bombs. It had remote-controlled gun turrets and a fully pressurized cabin. But most dangerous of all, it had range. From tiny islands in the Pacific, it struck mainland Japan. From India, it soared over the Himalayan mountains. In time, it would rain fire on Tokyo and beyond. The Germans understood what that meant. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol. And symbols in war are powerful. Adolf Hitler called for an answer. He named it the America Bomber. He wanted a plane that could fly from German soil, cross the Atlantic Ocean, strike New York City, and return without refueling. Not just a strike, a message. Proof that the Third Reich still had reach, that its spirit was unbroken, that no city, no matter how far, was truly safe. 3 companies stepped forward: Messerschmitt, Junkers, Heinkel. Each promised a machine that could rival the American giant. Each offered sketches, models, wind tunnel data, all of them under pressure. Time was running out. So were the materials, the workers, and the factories. High-octane fuel was being sent to fighter squadrons. Aluminum was stored under lock and key. Allied raids destroyed factories faster than they could be rebuilt. Engineering teams worked in candlelight. Designers fled to underground bunkers when sirens howled. But the order never changed. Build the bomber. Reach across the ocean. Prove that German steel could still create fear across continents, even if the Reich itself was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own dreams. He was not a soldier, not a party man. He didn't wear medals or carry a pistol, but he believed in what he built. Dr. Hans Pullman had spent the first years of the war designing gliders for students in Leipzig. Before the bombs came, before the ration books, before the whispers that Germany might not win. In 1943, the Reich called him up, not to the front, but to the sky. They needed men who could dream in wingspan, and Hans Pullman could. He arrived at the Junkers plant in Dessau with one purpose: to help build the plane that would strike America. A bomber larger than anything the world had ever flown. Not for battlefields, but for cities oceans away. A symbol of reach, of revenge. A message from a crumbling empire to a rising one. He poured his soul into the Junkers Ju 390, a machine that looked more like a ship than an aircraft. 6 engines, nearly 170 feet of wingspan, reinforced struts so wide you could crawl through them. The engineers nicknamed it the Whale. Every day, Pullman walked the hangar floor in silence, checking welds, measuring tolerances. He believed not in the Reich's propaganda, but in the purity of the challenge, to make something that could touch the clouds. They scheduled the first flight for February 1944. It was cold that morning, the kind of German winter where your breath freezes on your collar before you speak. A crowd gathered behind the airfield fence. They had heard the rumors that this was the plane meant to strike New York, that it could fly across oceans, that it was the future. Pullman stood near the tower, holding a notepad he would barely use. The pilot throttled up. 6 engines thundered. The Whale rolled forward slow and heavy. The tail lifted. The crowd held its breath. At 2,000 feet, the aircraft began to tremble. Not a vibration, a shudder. Deep in the fuselage, bolts strained against force they were never meant to carry. Pullman felt it before he heard it. A deep metallic groan like a bridge buckling under weight. They pressed on. At 6,000 feet, the left inboard engine began to leak oil. The temperature gauge spiked. The pilot radioed a warning but kept climbing. At 8,000 feet, a loud crack echoed through the cabin. An oil line burst. One propeller lost power. The crew dumped fuel. The aircraft pitched slightly, fighting the drag. They turned back, limping toward the airfield. No one cheered when they landed. No medals, no photographs. Pullman walked alone into his office. In his flight log, he wrote a single sentence: structural vibration at load threshold. Further reinforcement required. He knew what it meant. The plane was too heavy, the frame too weak, the dream too large, but he never said it aloud. Because in war, silence was safer than truth. The whispers began in Zurich. A few grainy photographs smuggled through a Swiss intermediary, a scribbled report from a neutral port, and then the confirmation. The Americans had not only built the B-29, they were producing them by the thousands. At first, German engineers scoffed. No one builds aircraft that large in wartime, not without failure, not without decades of testing. But then they saw the blueprints, or what they could piece together. The truth struck like a blade across the drafting tables. The B-29 was not just a bomber. It was a masterpiece of industrial precision. Its cabin was pressurized, allowing crews to operate at altitudes that would have killed men in most Luftwaffe aircraft. Its gun turrets were operated by analog computers, a network of remote-controlled systems linked by servo motors and powered gyroscopes. Its wings housed fuel tanks wrapped in self-sealing bladders, and its engines, the Wright R-3350, delivered more than 2,000 horsepower each, cooled by a dual-row radial system so advanced it defied belief. But the real shock was not in the systems. It was in the tolerances. The Americans had achieved production margins as tight as 1,000th of an inch. Weld seams that passed X-ray inspections, rivet lines aligned by automated jigs. Germany, by contrast, was still cutting metal by hand. Its factories relied on skilled labor, not machines. Its technicians tuned parts with files, not lasers. Their war effort was brilliant, but artisanal. One engineer wrote privately, "They are not just building bombers. They are building instruments that happen to fly." No matter how many drafts they produced, how many parts they copied, the core problem could not be ignored. Germany lacked the industrial infrastructure to replicate the American design, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked the machine culture required to build machines like that at scale. And in war, building one was not enough. To understand why Germany's answer to the B-29 failed, you have to go inside the machine. Not the sketch, not the propaganda photo, the actual metal. Start with the engine. The Americans had built the Wright R-3350, a twin-row 18-cylinder radial engine that delivered over 2,200 horsepower. Each one was cooled by a massive turbo supercharger system that regulated pressure at high altitudes. The entire setup was a masterpiece of balance. Fuel, air, and oil all dancing in harmony under brutal stress. It took thousands of parts, thousands of hours, and a supply chain stretching across half a continent. And Boeing was building 4 of them into every B-29. Germany's best offering was the BMW 801. It produced 1,600 horsepower at best. Without turbocharging, its performance dropped off sharply above 20,000 feet. And unlike its American counterpart, it overheated regularly. German mechanics called it temperamental. Allied pilots called it a gift. When they tried to scale up, the trouble got worse. The Ju-390 needed 6 engines just to get off the ground. That meant more weight, more fuel, more stress on the wing route. During testing, engine fires became so common that ground crews kept foam trucks ready before every takeoff. Then there was the pressurization problem. The B-29 had a fully sealed cabin, a technological first. Crews could fly above 30,000 feet without oxygen masks. The pressure system included specialized ducts, insulated walls, and flexible seals around doors and windows. It even had a crawl tunnel between the cockpit and tail, so gunners could move while staying pressurized. Germany attempted to replicate this. On paper, they understood the concept, but they lacked the synthetic rubber, the fine seals, the leak-proof ducts. In one test, frost formed on the inside of the observation dome. A rivet seam cracked at 22,000 feet. The cabin depressurized instantly, blasting freezing air into the faces of the crew. One flight engineer suffered frostbite across both cheeks. The aircraft dropped altitude within seconds. No further pressurization tests were attempted, and that was only the crew. The airframe had its own limits. The Ju-390 was not a clean sheet design. It was a stretched version of the Junkers Ju-290, itself a long-range transport with known structural issues. Engineers added wing extensions, larger fuel tanks, and reinforced gear. But every addition introduced new vibrations, new stresses. In flight, the wings flexed visibly. At high speeds, the tailplane shivered so violently that one test pilot reported blurred vision from the vibration. The American B-29, in contrast, had been wind tunnel tested for years. Its wing shape, load distribution, and engine mounts were all optimized by machines. Its structural stress points were mapped with data. Its tolerances were logged in decimal points smaller than the naked eye could see. In the Boeing plants, automated jigs aligned entire fuselages within fractions of a millimeter. In Germany, mechanics lined up parts with chalk and string. There was also the fuel issue. A round-trip mission to New York would require over 40,000 liters of aviation fuel, the kind of high-octane gasoline Germany no longer had. In 1944, they tried alternative blends. They even proposed adding detachable fuel tanks to the wings. But the more weight they added, the more the aircraft bent. It became a paradox of diminishing returns. The farther they tried to go, the more dangerous it became to try. And still, the Reich pressed forward. Because this wasn't just an airplane. It was political theater. The engineers knew the design was flawed. The pilots knew the range numbers were fantasy. But no one wanted to be the one to say it. The fear was not technical. It was ideological. In one memo, an anonymous Junkers engineer wrote, "We are building an idea, not an aircraft. The idea is weightless, but the machine is not." The deeper the war dragged on, the more disconnected the specifications became from reality. Germany could build prototypes, but they could not build systems. They had brilliant minds, but no industrial lungs to breathe life into the machine. So the Ju-390 became something strange. Not a weapon, not even a prototype, but a ghost in waiting. Built too late, too heavy and too hopeful. By the summer of 1944, the walls were closing in. The Allies had landed at Normandy. France was slipping away. The Red Army was crashing through the Eastern Front like a tidal wave. And inside Germany's own borders, the air war was all but lost. Every daylight brought new waves of American bombers. Every night brought fire from the British sky. But in Dessau at the Junkers plant, the engineers kept working. Not because they believed the war could be won, but because they had been told that one final symbol might still change everything. One aircraft, one mission, one statement. The Ju-390 had already flown its first test and nearly failed. But the second prototype, designated V-2, was being prepared for something bolder. There were whispers that Hitler himself wanted it ready for a reconnaissance flight over the Atlantic, perhaps even a symbolic bombing run. There was talk of striking Halifax, or better, Manhattan. Fuel calculations were made. Extra tanks were welded into the wing roots. Crews were briefed in secret. The Reich Ministry drafted press releases before the plane had even left the hangar. The target, New York. The plan: take off from southern France, fly out across the Atlantic, photograph the skyline, and return, even if it meant ditching in neutral Spain. But the aircraft was not ready. Its engines still ran hot. The wing flex was still dangerous. Test pilots warned against high-altitude turns. One mechanic, after running ground tests for 12 hours, collapsed from exhaustion and never returned to work. Still, they pushed on. To inspire confidence, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels leaked a statement. A new long-range aircraft capable of touching the enemy homeland is now operational. The press dubbed it the America Bomber. Western intelligence noticed. In Britain, Royal Air Force analysts scoured the reports. They had heard of the Ju-390 before, but now they feared it might actually be flying. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services produced an urgent bulletin warning that New York may be within range of a surprise symbolic attack. The myth was growing faster than the machine itself. In truth, V-2 never left the continent. That August, Allied bombers hit the airfield at Brandis, the staging site for the Ju-390. The second prototype was still in assembly, its landing gear half installed, engines in crates. A single high-explosive blast tore through the hangar wall and blew the fuselage off its jigs. The aircraft crumpled sideways like an aluminum skeleton. It never flew again. Back at Dessau, Pullman watched as the dream unraveled. Resources vanished. The engineers were reassigned. One was drafted into the Volkssturm and killed in Dresden. Another fled west with his family, burning his design notes before leaving. Even the original prototype, the only one to fly, was quietly dismantled in early 1945, piece by piece, and buried outside Prague to keep it from falling into Allied hands. But the rumors did not stop. Months later, as the Reich collapsed, captured German officers claimed that the Ju-390 had flown over the Atlantic and returned, that it had seen the lights of New York from high above and taken photographs, that it had struck fear into the American war machine. Historians would later debunk it. No records, no logs, no fuel capacity to support the claim. Even the Reich's own engineers called the story absurd. But the lie had already served its purpose. In a war where reality bent under propaganda, even failure could wear the mask of power. The aircraft had never crossed the Atlantic, never seen New York. It had barely crossed the southern mountains of Germany. But the myth soared where the metal could not. By April of 1945, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a ruin. Concrete lay in slabs. Telephone lines dangled from broken poles. The sky, once filled with ambition, now rumbled with Russian artillery. Deep inside a command bunker beneath the chancellery, Adolf Hitler clung to scraps of vision. Armies that no longer existed were redrawn on maps. Divisions that had dissolved weeks ago were reassigned by hand. Among the last dreams that flickered in that darkness was the America bomber. He had believed, or chosen to believe, that it had flown, that it had reached America, that it had proven the Reich could still project fear across oceans. No one corrected him, The truth never made it through the bunker's iron doors. At the Junkers headquarters, the final report had already been typed, signed, and stamped. It was short, brutal, clinical. Ju-390 prototype V1 achieved maximum altitude of 15,000 feet with reduced load. Severe vibration observed in rear fuselage. Pressurization system failed under routine stress. Engine thermal instability remains unresolved. Projected operational range 100 miles. All test goals unfulfilled. Attached was a handwritten note from the program director. Recommend cancellation. Strategic value no longer justifies continued allocation of material. The report was filed. No fanfare, no meeting, no medals. It never reached Hitler's hands. His inner circle chose silence, perhaps out of fear, perhaps because they had nothing left to offer. They allowed the myth to linger, that somewhere above the Atlantic a German bomber had soared over New York, unseen, unstoppable, divine. But the engineers knew. The ground crews knew. The men who watched the second prototype torn open by shrapnel at Brandis knew. The aircraft had never left Europe. It had never crossed the Alps, let alone the ocean. In its final days, the Third Reich was not powered by machines. It was powered by delusion. The America bomber was not a weapon. It was a story they told themselves until the silence became too loud to ignore. In war, the victor is not always the one with the best ideas. More often, it is the one who can turn those ideas into metal, again and again, without fail, without pause, and without compromise. Germany had ideas, extraordinary ones. They had the first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me 262. The first ballistic missile, the V2. They created guided bombs, wire-controlled torpedoes, even suborbital aircraft concepts. Their scientists drew blueprints for things the world would not build for another 20 years. But ideas are weightless. Airplanes are not. The story of the Ju-390 is not about a bad design. It is not even about arrogance. It is about the limits of brilliance without system, of genius without scaffolding. Germany could imagine marvels, but America could build them. That was the difference. At the heart of the B-29 was not just advanced engineering. It was standardization. Every rivet, every panel, every fuel line was interchangeable. Workers on the Wichita assembly lines could install a pressurized window the same way a worker in Renton did, because the tolerances never changed. The United States had invested decades into something Germany lacked: scalable, repeatable, precision manufacturing. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't flashy, but it worked. Each B-29 that rolled off the line was the same as the one before it. Crews could train on one aircraft and fly another without needing to learn new controls. Mechanics could replace a damaged part in Tokyo using a crate shipped from Kansas. Logistics didn't just support the aircraft, they defined it. Now look at Germany. The Ju-390 was made by hand, not because it had to be, but because it could only be. Skilled metal workers adjusted braces with wooden mallets. Engineers recalibrated fuselages with chalk marks and feel. Each aircraft was slightly different. Each required its own quirks to be understood. It wasn't a fleet. It was a set of experiments. And that kind of building doesn't win modern wars. Modern wars are not about who flies highest, but who lands hardest, most often, with the least friction in between. And in this, America had built something Germany could not: a machine culture. In the United States, entire industries had been bent toward a single outcome: production without failure. Railways synchronized schedules to supply plants. Steel mills adjusted alloys to meet bulk specifications. Even typewriter factories were retooled to make gun sights. It wasn't genius. It was discipline. And discipline builds empires. Germany never built enough Ju-390s to field a squadron. America built over 3,000 B-29s and kept them flying for more than a decade. They fought in Japan, in Korea, in skies thick with weather and gunfire, and they came home. That is not a result of better drawings. That is a result of better foundations. Genius solves a problem once. Infrastructure solves it every day. The Ju-390 never had a chance, not because it was poorly conceived, but because it was never surrounded by the ecosystem it needed. Its wings may have been wide, but its roots were shallow. And in the storm of total war, shallow roots do not survive. So in the end, the Ju-390 became something strange. Not a weapon, not a tool, but a symbol of what might have been. It was not beaten by American guns or pilots or bombs. It was beaten by factory floor tolerances, by conveyor belts, by machining depth, by bolt standardization, by people in denim jumpsuits checking rivet lines under fluorescent light. Germany reached for the sky with art. America reached it with a ruler. That is the quiet, unromantic truth, and it is perhaps the most powerful truth of all. When the war ended, there was no ceremony for the Ju-390, no fanfare, no museum, no flag-draped photos of its crew, no monument for what it could have been. What was left of it, the only one that had ever flown, was found abandoned in a clearing near Prague. Grass had grown up through its landing gear. The aluminum skin was pitted with rain. Birds had nested in the tail. To the Allied soldiers who stumbled upon it, it looked like something half-finished, a shell, a question with no answer. Some said it had been hidden to keep it from capture. Others believed the Germans had simply run out of parts. But no one flew it again. The remains were dismantled, carted off in pieces, melted down, and forgotten, except by the sky. Because the sky never forgets what it almost held. The Ju-390 had reached into the air with ambition, desperate, doomed, defiant. It had struggled upward under the weight of hope, lifted by men who knew it might never return. And for a moment, it had flown. Briefly, uneasily, and then, not again. It became one of war's ghost machines. Not because it failed, but because it never truly lived. Meanwhile, the B-29 kept flying. It flew over Japan, dropping destruction and smoke. It flew over Korea, delivering supplies and strategy. It flew into textbooks, into documentaries, into the memories of nations. It was not perfect. It was never meant to be. But it worked. And because it worked, it endured. That is the cruel arithmetic of history. Legacy does not belong to the brilliant. It belongs to the builders. Germany had dared to touch the unreachable, but they had done so with fingers made of glass. The Ju-390 was too large for its frame, too bold for its moment, too alone in its vision. No supply line stood behind it, no system to hold it up. And so it sank. Today, few remember the plane's name. Fewer still have seen a photo. Its wings are gone, its purpose lost. But the story remains, not in metal, but in meaning. Because sometimes what matters most is not what flew, but what tried to fly, and why it fell back to earth. The Ju-390 is gone, but the lesson it left behind still circles in the wind. That power without structure will always collapse. That reach without roots is just a fall in waiting. And that the sky, for all its beauty, has never once forgiven the unprepared. Sometimes I wonder what that single flight felt like. The one and only time the Ju-390 lifted off. Did the pilot know it might never fly again? Did the engineers feel pride or guilt as they watched it tremble against the cold wind? Did they see it as failure, or as the last flicker of belief in a world unraveling around them? We talk so much about winners in war, but history is shaped just as much by what didn't happen, by the machines that never made it to the battlefield, by the missions that never left the ground, by the dreams that couldn't survive the truth. And in that silence, sometimes I find more meaning than in any explosion. So let me ask you, what do you think is more powerful? The weapon that flies, or the one that never could? And in the end, which one teaches us more?